The Stargate had taken them to places that defied explanation. SG-1 had walked through the event horizon and emerged in the courts of false gods, on the bridges of ancient warships, inside the memory of a dying civilization. They had stepped through the gate and found paradise, and they had stepped through it and found hell. After 8 years of service, Colonel Jack O'Neill had developed what he privately considered a finely tuned instinct for which kind of arrival this was going to be. The moment his boots hit the gate room floor of Atlantis, he knew. This was the second kind. The city was alive with the particular electricity of people who have accepted that they might die today and decided to keep working anyway. Technicians moved at a controlled sprint across the gantry above. Someone was shouting coordinates in a language Jack didn't recognize. 3 Marines in full combat gear pushed past the gate before the event horizon had fully collapsed, barely sparing the 4 new arrivals a glance, which said everything about how badly things had already deteriorated. When heavily armed soldiers stop caring who just came through the gate, the situation has cleared some kind of threshold. This is not P3X something, Daniel said quietly, turning a slow circle, his eyes moving up the soaring architecture the way they always did. Cataloging, reaching, hungry to understand. No, Sam agreed. Her hand had already moved to her weapon, not drawing, just making contact. A reflex. Jack, these energy readings are. Not now, Carter. Teal'c said nothing. He stood at O'Neill's shoulder, staff weapon held at a neutral angle, and watched the room with the patient attention of a man who had spent decades learning that the first 30 seconds in a new place contained everything you needed to know about it. What he saw was controlled chaos. Competent people under extreme pressure. Military and civilian operating side by side with the practiced ease of a team that had been through bad days before. He approved of that, at least. Hey! The shout came from the upper level. A man was leaning over the railing, young-faced but with officer's bearing, wearing a uniform that bore no insignia Jack recognized. Who are you people and how did you just come through that gate? Colonel Jack O'Neill, United States Air Force, Stargate Command. Jack looked up at him. And I'd love to explain exactly what we're doing here, but first. What's the threat level? Because everyone in this room is moving like we've got maybe 20 minutes before something very bad happens. The man stared at him for a long moment. Then, closer to 2 hours. Maybe less. He started moving toward the stairs. I'm Major John Shepard. And you picked one hell of a day to drop in. That was the moment Dr. Elizabeth Weir appeared, moving down the stairs with the measured pace of someone who had already spent today making decisions that would define the rest of her career, however long that career turned out to be. She was calm in the way that people become calm when the luxury of panic has been exhausted. Jack recognized it. He'd worn that calm himself, more times than he could count. Dr. Elizabeth Weir, she said, extending her hand. Head of the Atlantis expedition. I'm going to need to know a great deal more about who you are and how you got here. Our Stargate hasn't been connected to the Milky Way network since we arrived in this galaxy. About that, Sam said, and Jack caught the particular note in her voice, the one that meant she was already 3 steps into a theory and choosing which parts to share. We were dialing a standard mission address when there was an energy spike we couldn't account for. The gate connected. We came through. Given the architecture and the technology level I'm already reading in this room, I'd estimate we're no longer in the Milky Way at all. Weir absorbed this with a composure that Jack found genuinely impressive. You're in the Pegasus Galaxy, she said. In the city of Atlantis. And in approximately, she glanced at a technician who held up 2 fingers. Under 2 hours, a fleet of Wraith hive ships is going to reach weapons range of this city. Wraith, Daniel repeated. He had his notebook out already. Of course he did. That's the the life force feeding species? The ones your expedition has been encountering? Yes. Weir's eyes moved between the four of them, reading them the way good leaders always did, not just rank and file, but capability, reliability, what they'd do when things got worse. I have to be honest with you, Colonel O'Neill. I don't know if your arrival is a miracle or a complication. Possibly both. Jack nodded. Story of our lives, Doctor. Outside the towering windows of the gate room, the ocean of Atlantis caught the last clean light of a sun that didn't know, or didn't care, that the world beneath it was counting down. The spires of the city rose against a sky that was still, for a few more hours, perfectly clear. Somewhere in the deep beyond that sky, something ancient and hungry was coming, and it had been coming for 10,000 years, and it had never once been stopped. If you want to see more of these crossover stories, hit that subscribe button and drop a character, or a team, you'd want to see collide with another universe in the comments below. May the Force, and the Ancients, be with you. SG-1 had 2 hours to learn everything about a galaxy they'd never seen, an enemy they'd never faced, and a city full of exhausted people who had been carrying an impossible weight alone. Jack O'Neill set his P-90 on safe, looked out at that alien ocean, and got to work. Elizabeth had negotiated with system lords. She had sat across tables from people who considered human life a resource to be managed, and she had held her ground, and she had brought her people home. She was not, by any reasonable measure, easily intimidated. But standing in the Atlantis briefing room with Colonel Jack O'Neill across the table, she found herself in a negotiation unlike any she had prepared for. Not because he was aggressive, he wasn't. Not because he was dismissive. He'd proven in the first 10 minutes that he listened more carefully than his expression suggested. It was because he had the particular quality of someone who had already seen the worst-case scenario play out and survived it, and that made him genuinely difficult to manage. "Walk me through what you have," he said. It wasn't a request dressed as one. It was a request that knew it deserved an answer. We looked at Shepard, who gave her the smallest shrug. The one that meant I think we should trust them without him having to say it and be held accountable for it. She'd learned to read John Shepard's shrugs the way other people read formal reports. This one was reliable. 3 hive ships, she said. Possibly more behind them. Our long-range sensors are degraded. We've been cannibalizing power systems to keep the shield operational. Current ZPM output is at 11%. When it fails, the shield fails. When the shield fails, the city dies, O'Neill said. Not dramatically. Just as a fact to be accounted for. The city dies, we're confirmed. We have one alpha site we can evacuate to. We've been considering the self-destruct to prevent Wraith access to ancient technology. The silence that followed had weight to it. Across the table, Daniel Jackson had stopped writing and was looking at her with an expression she hadn't expected, not horror, exactly, but recognition. As though the calculus of destroying something irreplaceable to protect something more irreplaceable was familiar territory. "You've been here how long?" he asked. "Just under a year. And in that year, with everything you've discovered," he gestured at the city around them, at 10,000 years of ancient achievement humming in the walls. "You've been carrying this alone. No reinforcements. No backup from Earth. The Daedalus is 18 days out," Shepard said, from his position leaning against the wall. "Give or take. 18 days is a long time," Teal'c observed. It was the first thing he'd said since the briefing began, and the quiet authority of it drew every eye in the room. He met each gaze without adjustment. "We faced similar isolation in our early campaigns against the Goa'uld. Reinforcements were never coming. We learned to use what we had." Shepard looked at him with the direct assessment of one soldier measuring another. "What did you have?" Each other, Teal'c said. And the willingness to do what others believed impossible. It wasn't inspirational in the way speeches were inspirational. It was something more useful. It was the testimony of someone who had actually done it. We'll let the moment settle, then redirect it. Colonel O'Neill, I need to understand what you're bringing to this situation before I can decide how to integrate your team. You said you've been fighting the Goa'uld for 8 years. Give or take. The Wraith are not the Goa'uld. No, Sam Carter said, from the seat beside O'Neill. She'd spent the first portion of the briefing quietly reviewing data that Weir's chief scientist, a compact, rapid-fire Czech named Zelenka, had been feeding her on a tablet, and her expression had been cycling through a range of scientific emotions that had learned to read as "this is fascinating" followed closely by "this is also terrifying." They're not. But the tactical problem shares structural similarities. Technologically superior. Enemy. Numerical disadvantage. Limited resources. Unconventional solutions required. She paused. What's your Naquata situation? The Atlantis personnel exchanged glances. Our what? Zelenka asked. Naquata. It's a mineral we use for, actually, that's probably not relevant here. What energy weapons do you have access to? Not personal sidearms. Big ones. Shepard straightened slightly. We have the chair. Ancient weapons platform. Problem is it needs a strong ATA gene to operate, and our best gene carrier is not available right now, Weir said carefully. Jack O'Neill had been quiet for several minutes, which in Weir's short experience of him was not inactivity, it was processing. She'd watched his eyes move around the room during the briefing, cataloging exits, personnel, sight lines. The habit of someone who never fully turned off the part of his brain responsible for keeping people alive. I have the ancient gene, he said. The room shifted. Naturally expressed? Shepard asked, and there was something new in his voice. Something careful, the way you were careful around something you desperately needed but didn't want too much. So they tell me. Never quite figured out why. O'Neill looked at Weir. What's the chair? What followed was the most compressed technical briefing Weir had ever witnessed. Zelenka talking at speed, Carter asking precise follow-up questions that cut to the structural core of each answer, and O'Neill listening to none of the technical detail whatsoever while somehow extracting the single relevant fact. There was a weapons platform capable of destroying hive ships, it needed him to operate it, and it was currently running on a power source that was nearly dead. Nearly, Carter said, looking up from the tablet, is not the same as completely. Zelenka looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between two brilliant minds that were recognized as the opening move of either a great collaboration or a spectacular argument. There may be options we haven't considered, Zelenka said slowly. There are always options people haven't considered, Sam replied. Show me everything. O'Neill watched them go with the expression of a man who had learned, through hard experience, that the best thing he could do for Samantha Carter was get out of her way. He turned back to Weir. 2 hours, he said. Less, now. Then let's talk about what we're actually going to do. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, the easy posture of someone who had held harder rooms than this. Because self-destructing the city is a last resort, not a plan. And I've never been a fan of last resorts. Weir held his gaze. In another life, in another set of circumstances, she thought Jack O'Neill might have been exactly the kind of man she found difficult to work with. Too certain, too fast, too willing to move before consensus was reached. Today, with the clock running and the Wraith coming, she found him entirely necessary. Then let's make a plan, she said. The problem with Atlantis's ZPM was not, Rodney McKay would have explained to anyone willing to listen, that it was failing. The problem was that it was failing elegantly, degrading in a pattern so mathematically precise that it almost looked intentional, like a countdown designed by someone who wanted you to know exactly how little time you had left and exactly how helpless you were to stop it. It was, in McKay's private and thoroughly unshared opinion, the most beautifully cruel piece of engineering he had ever encountered. He was in the middle of communicating this, to Zelenka, who wasn't listening, and to the ZPM housing itself, which definitely wasn't listening, when Samantha Carter walked into the lab. He recognized her. That was the first thing, and it mattered, because recognition in this moment arrived with a weight that caught him off guard. He knew her name from the SGC's published theoretical work, which was classified at a level that McKay had absolutely not been cleared to access and had accessed anyway because some papers were simply too important to leave unread. Carter's work on gate bridge theory. Her refinements to the dialing computer algorithms. The unpublished, extremely unpublished paper on Nequadria instability that had circulated in certain circles 3 years ago under a pseudonym that had fooled absolutely no one with a functioning brain. He had opinions about all of it. Strong ones. Carefully organized. McKay, Zelenka said, with the particular tone that meant please behave. Dr. Carter, McKay said. Your phase discriminator calculations in the 99 gate bridge paper were wrong. Carter looked at him. Her expression did not change in any way that could be called readable. They were subsequently corrected in the follow-up paper. Which took you 3 months. Which took me 3 months because I was also dismantling a gold mothership at the time. She looked at the ZPM housing, then at the power reading scrolling across the nearest screen, then back at McKay. 11%. 10.7, as of 4 minutes ago. And the discharge curve is logarithmic. Not linear. Which means the last 10% goes faster than the math suggests it should. He pulled up the projection. At current drain rate, factoring in the shield maintenance load and the secondary systems we can't shut down without losing life support on 3 levels, we have 93 minutes, Carter said, looking at the curve. McKay stared at her. 94. The inflection point is here. She touched the screen, one precise fingertip on the curve. You're not accounting for the thermal variance in the containment field at low charge states. The discharge accelerates slightly earlier than the standard model predicts. He looked at where she was pointing. He looked at the data. He experienced the specific and deeply unpleasant sensation of realizing someone else was right about something in his own lab. 93, he said. Give or take. There was a pause that might, under different circumstances, have been companionable. Under these circumstances it was the pause of 2 people simultaneously running calculations and arriving at the same brutal conclusion. We can't recharge it, McKay said. I want to be clear about that before you suggest it. We don't have a star close enough, we don't have the equipment for controlled extraction even if we did, and the ZPM's own internal structure is too degraded to accept a significant charge input without cascade failure. I wasn't going to suggest recharging it. You weren't. The energy isn't the problem, Carter said. She had moved to the secondary console and was pulling up the city's power distribution architecture with the ease of someone who had been working with ancient systems for years, which, McKay realized with a start, she had. Just different ancient systems. The SGC had been interfacing with ancient and ancient-derived technology since the early days. Carter hadn't learned Atlantis' systems, but she'd learned the language of the civilization that built them. The problem is waste. You're losing significant power in the distribution network itself. These relay junctions, she highlighted 4 nodes in the city's grid. The efficiency rating on these is at 63%. That's not degradation. That's a configuration choice someone made early in your expedition and never revisited. Zelenka made a sound. It was a small sound, but it contained multitudes. McKay looked at the nodes. He looked at Carter. He looked at the nodes again. Those were configured during the initial power-up sequence when we first arrived. We were focused on, there were other priorities. I know. I'm not criticizing the choice. I'm saying if we reconfigure those junctions, optimize the distribution pathways, and reroute the secondary shield harmonics through the auxiliary conduit rather than the primary, she was already typing. We reduced the drain load by approximately 18%. 18, McKay repeated. 18.3, accounting for the thermal variance we just discussed. The calculation landed in McKay's mind and immediately began rearranging furniture. 18% of current load, extended across 93 minutes of remaining charge, factoring in the reduced drain rate from the reconfiguration itself, that gives us another 22 minutes. 23, Carter said. But close enough. 23 minutes is not going to stop 3 hive ships. No, she agreed. But it might be the difference between the weapons chair having enough power to fire and not. She looked at him directly. Your Colonel Shepard told me O'Neill is going to try to operate it. O'Neill has never operated an ancient weapons platform in his life. O'Neill sat in the chair at McMurdo and interfaced with it well enough to launch drones without training or preparation. Carter's voice carried the particular quality of someone stating a fact they'd personally witnessed. His gene expression is the strongest we've ever recorded. If anyone can operate that chair on depleted power with no practice time, it's him. McKay absorbed this. The situation had been, 1 hour ago, a specific kind of hopeless. The hopeless where you knew exactly what was going to kill you and roughly when. It was now a different kind. The kind where there was a thread, thin as spider silk, leading somewhere that wasn't certain death. McKay had spent his entire career grabbing threads like that and pulling. The reconfiguration will take 40 minutes, he said. If we start now. 35, Carter said. If we work together. It was not, McKay would reflect later, the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It was considerably more useful than that. It was the beginning of a functional working relationship between two people who were each privately certain they were the smarter one, and who were each just uncertain enough about that certainty to actually listen to the other. Zelenka, watching from the corner, allowed himself a very small smile and said nothing at all. Outside the lab windows, the ocean caught the light and threw it back in pieces, and somewhere in the system's outer dark, 3 hive ships adjusted their approach vectors and continued their patient, ancient advance toward a city that was not yet finished fighting. Daniel Jackson had a gift for walking into rooms where he wasn't expected and making himself indispensable before anyone thought to ask him to leave. It was not a calculated skill. It was the natural consequence of genuine curiosity combined with the kind of encyclopedic knowledge base that made him useful in situations that had nothing to do with his official job description. He had translated under fire, negotiated with ascended beings, and once talked his way out of a gold execution chamber using nothing but an incomplete understanding of ancient Sumerian honorifics. He was, in the language of people who worked with him regularly, a lot. Teal'c and Ronon had been briefed on the 4 arrivals in the same clipped, efficient way that Atlantis personnel had been briefed on most things during the siege preparations. Quickly, incompletely, with the understanding that full context was a luxury the situation couldn't afford. She knew they were from another galaxy. She knew they had fought powerful enemies. She knew Dr. Were considered them an asset, which was enough for her to extend the initial measure of trust that her people called the first breath, the moment before you knew someone, when you chose to believe they meant no harm. She found Daniel in the Atlantis database room, which surprised her. Most soldiers, in her experience, used pre-battle hours to check weapons, review tactical plans, or sit with their fear in whatever private way their culture permitted. This one was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of a holographic display, cycling through ancient records at a speed that suggested he could actually read them. You can access the database, she said. It came out more like an observation than a question. Daniel looked up. He had the eyes of someone who was always slightly more interested in what was in front of him than in managing how that interest appeared to others. Ancient and its derivative dialects, yes. Not fluently, my ancient is academic rather than conversational, and there are variant constructions in these records I haven't seen before. Pegasus branch, I'd guess. The language drifted over 10,000 years of separation from the Milky Way dialect. He paused. You're Teal'c. Major Shepard mentioned you during the briefing. He mentioned you as well. She came further into the room, drawn partly by the display and partly by something in his manner that felt less like a stranger and more like someone she had already, in some essential way, met. What are you looking for? Wraith Origin Records. He said it simply, without the careful framing that most people used when approaching subjects they thought might be sensitive. I've read the expedition's initial reports, Dr. We shared them while the others were in the briefing. The Wraith are remarkable. Not in a comfortable way. In a way that demands understanding. Teal'c settled into a seat across from him. Most people who encounter the Wraith for the first time focus on surviving them. Not on understanding them. Most people who focused only on surviving the gold are dead, Daniel said. Not harshly. As a simple accounting of experience. The ones who survived. Us, most of the time, by very thin margins, were the ones who understood why they did what they did. What they wanted. What they feared. He looked back at the display. The gold were parasitic, narcissistic, terrified of death. Their entire civilization was built around that terror. Once you understood that, you could predict them. Manipulate them. Find the cracks. He glanced at her. What do the Wraith fear? Teal'c was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she had been asked before, not in those terms. The people of Pegasus feared the Wraith the way they feared storms or sickness, as forces of nature, not as entities with interior lives that could be examined and exploited. Hunger, she said finally. And the end of feeding. Which is the same fear, Daniel said softly. Framed differently. Extinction. He pulled up a sequence of records, ancient text scrolling alongside holographic renderings of what looked like ancient biological diagrams. The expedition's database has Atlantean records from before the Wraith War. Not many, most were destroyed or sealed, but enough to suggest that the Wraith weren't always what they are now. There's something here about a conversion event. A biological shift in the early war period. He looked at her. You have a connection to them. I read that in the reports too. A sensitivity. My people carry Wraith DNA, Teal'c said. The words came out with the practiced steadiness of someone who had long since processed the discomfort of that truth and arrived somewhere more complex. It was done by the Wraith themselves, generations ago. I can sense them. Sometimes hear their thoughts, if they are close enough. She paused. They are close enough now. Daniel stopped cycling through records. He looked at her with his full attention, which was, she was discovering, a considerable thing. What do you hear? Anticipation, she said. They are not rushing. They never rush when they believe victory is certain. They are, savoring it. The approach. She met his eyes. They know we are weakened. They have known for some time. Someone told them. The word someone landed in the room like a stone in still water. A source inside Atlantis, Daniel said. I don't know. I have suspected. I have no proof. She held his gaze steadily. I am telling you because you asked me a question no one has asked before, and because you answered it honestly instead of telling me the feeling will pass. She paused. And because if there is a source, and if the Wraith Queen is directing this siege with specific knowledge of our weaknesses, she will know about your team now. 4 people from another galaxy, carrying knowledge of technologies and enemies she has never encountered. She will want that knowledge. Daniel absorbed this with the stillness of someone who had been the object of unwanted divine interest before and had developed a healthy respect for how complicated that became. She'll try to capture one of us. She will try to capture the most valuable one, Teal'c said. The one who knows the most. Who has seen the most. They looked at each other across the dim light of the database room, surrounded by 10,000 years of a civilization's accumulated knowledge, and the same conclusion arrived in both their minds at the same moment with the specific inevitability of things that are obvious once someone asks the right question. Daniel, he said. Yes, Teal'c agreed. You. He was quiet for a moment. Then, we should probably tell Jack. Yes. He's going to make a face. Teal'c considered this. Major Shepard also makes a face. When things become more complicated than they were. It is a similar face. It's a universal face, Daniel said, and began shutting down the display with the brisk efficiency of someone who had just added an item to an already complicated day and was choosing not to dwell on it. Come on. And on the way, tell me everything you know about how the Queens communicate with their fleet. Everything. Even the things that seem irrelevant. Teal'c rose and followed him toward the door, and she found herself thinking that this man, this civilian, this scholar who read dead languages in the hour before a siege, reminded her of the ancestors in the oldest stories her people told. Not because he was powerful. Because he understood that knowledge, properly used, was the oldest weapon in any galaxy. Outside, the first faint tremor moved through the city's superstructure. Not an earthquake. Not a systems failure. A wraith dart, testing the edge of the shield. The siege had begun its opening movement. Jack O'Neill had proposed bad plans before. He was, in fact, somewhat famous for it within the SGC. Not because his plans were genuinely bad, but because they had a consistent quality of sounding catastrophically reckless in the briefing room and then working anyway. Jack O'Neill had proposed bad plans before. He was, in fact, somewhat famous for it within the SGC, not because his plans were genuinely bad, but because they had a consistent quality of sounding catastrophically reckless in the briefing room and then working anyway, which was a track record that inspired a specific kind of exasperated confidence in the people who knew him well and a specific kind of horror in the people who didn't. The plan he outlined in Atlantis's main briefing room, 47 minutes before the Wraith fleet reached optimal weapons range, fell squarely into the catastrophically reckless category. We bait the Queen, he said. The room received this in silence. Weir was the first to respond. Colonel. Hear me out. He moved to the tactical display, where the 3 hive ships were rendered as red icons moving in a patient, unhurried arc toward the city's position. Teal'c told Daniel the Queen is directing this personally. She has specific intel on your weaknesses, shield status, ZPM output, personnel numbers. That means she's been running this like a targeted operation, not a standard culling. She wants something specific. Us being here, he gestured between himself and his team. That changes her calculus. We're an unknown variable. Unknown variables make careful commanders cautious. Or aggressive, Weir said. Or aggressive, Jack agreed easily. Which is also useful. Here's what I know about commanders who want something specific. They don't delegate the retrieval. They come for it themselves. Or they send something they trust completely. He looked at Teal'c. If she knows about us, she'll adjust her approach. Instead of a full assault on the shield, she'll try to extract us first. Remove the variable before the main engagement. Shepard had been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone doing rapid tactical math. She'll send a boarding party. Something small enough to move through the city quietly, before the main fleet engages, Jack confirmed. Which means we have a window, maybe 20 minutes, between when she commits to the extraction attempt and when the hive ships move into firing range. In that window, the fleet holds position. They don't fire on the city while she's trying to retrieve what she wants from inside it. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of people following the logic and not entirely hating where it led. You want to use yourselves as bait, Weir said. To buy time for the weapons chair to be operational. Carter and McKay need 35 minutes, Jack said. We have 47 until the fleet reaches weapons range. If we can delay the main engagement by creating a priority extraction situation. 20 minutes of delay plus 47 minutes already on the clock, Shepard said. 67 minutes total. Against 35 needed. He uncrossed his arms. That's a workable margin. It's a margin built on the assumption that the Queen behaves exactly as we predict, Weir said. That she delays the fleet engagement for the extraction. That the boarding party is manageable. That your team can contain the situation without drawing resources away from the shield defense. She looked at O'Neill steadily. That's a significant number of assumptions. Yes, Jack said. And you're comfortable with that? I'm never comfortable, Jack said. But I've worked with worse math. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, not the tactical assessment dropping away, but something more honest moving through it. Dr. Weir. I've been in this city for less than 2 hours. I know that. I know you don't know me, and you don't have any particular reason to trust my read on this situation. But I've fought system lords. I've been inside a gold mother ship while it was being destroyed around me. I've watched a plan fall apart in real time and rebuilt it from pieces while people were dying. He held her gaze. I know what I'm doing. And right now, what I'm doing is telling you that this city does not have to die today. The room was very quiet. Weir looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Shepard, who gave her the shrug, the one that meant yes. What do you need? She said. What followed was 20 minutes of the most compressed planning session that Atlantis had hosted since the expedition's arrival. Shepard and O'Neill moved around the tactical display with the shorthand efficiency of two military minds that spoke the same fundamental language despite having learned it in entirely different classrooms. Ford took up a position at the secondary console, feeding them real-time sensor data as the Wraith fleet's approach vector continued its slow, deliberate arc. Teal'c sat across from Daniel, the two of them working through what she knew of Wraith boarding tactics. The way darts deployed retrieval teams, the communication patterns between Queen and soldiers, the specific vulnerability windows in a coordinated extraction operation. Teal'c stood at the window. He had been standing there for some time, which most people in the room had registered as stillness and interpreted as patience. It was patience, but it was the active kind, the kind that was simultaneously processing everything in the room and everything visible through the glass. After a moment, Ronon Dex moved to stand beside him, which surprised approximately no one who had watched both men in the same room for more than 10 minutes. You have fought enemies like the Wraith, Ronon said. It wasn't quite a question. We have fought enemies who believed themselves gods, Teal'c replied. Who fed upon human life as sustenance and right. Who could not be negotiated with or appealed to. Only defeated. He watched the ocean. The tactics adapt to the specific enemy. The fundamental truth does not change. What truth? That they can be killed. Teal'c looked at him. No matter how ancient. No matter how certain of victory. They can be killed. Ronon was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been running from them for 7 years. You are no longer running. Another silence. A different kind, not empty, but full of something being processed, being set down. Ronon looked out at the ocean with an expression that had something in it that might, in better light, have been called relief. At the tactical display, O'Neill was finalizing positions. Teal'c and Ronon would anchor the defense of the corridor most likely used for a Wraith boarding approach, the lower east pier, where the shield harmonics created a natural insertion point. Shepard and Ford would cover the secondary approach. Daniel and Teal'c would monitor the Queen's communication patterns from the control room, providing real-time intel on the extraction team's movements and intentions. Jack himself would be in the chair room. I need 15 minutes in that chair before the main engagement, he told Weir. Familiarization. I've interfaced with ancient tech before but never a weapons platform under combat conditions. 15 minutes, Weir said. Carson will be there. He knows the chair's systems better than anyone. Good. Jack looked around the room. At Shepard, at Teal'c, at the Atlantis personnel who had been carrying this impossible weight for a year with no help coming. Something in his expression that wasn't quite sentiment but was adjacent to it. One more thing. Whatever happens today, you people built something real out here. In the dark, a galaxy away from home, with no backup and no guarantee. That matters. I want you to know someone from Earth knows that. It was not the kind of thing Jack O'Neill said often. The room felt it. We're straightened slightly. Let's make sure there's an after today to remember it in, she said. The first full Wraith Dart screen appeared on the long-range sensors 14 minutes later, not heading for the city, but circling wide, coming in low over the ocean on an approach vector designed to avoid the shield's main emitters. Exactly as O'Neill had predicted. The Queen had taken the bait. The first Wraith came through the East Pier access junction at 0347 local Atlantis time, which was technically the middle of the night but felt, given the circumstances, like the most awake moment the city had experienced in weeks. Teal'c heard it before he saw it. Not the footstep. Wraith soldiers moved with the particular silence of predators who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of approach. What he heard was the change in air pressure as the access hatch cycled, the specific acoustic signature of a space that had been sealed becoming a space that was open. It was the kind of detail that most humanoid species filtered out as environmental noise. Teal'c had trained himself, over decades of service as First Prime, to filter nothing. He moved. The first Wraith soldier came through the hatch and met the end of Teal'c's staff weapon before it had fully oriented to the corridor. The blast at close range was not subtle. It was, however, effective. The soldier went down hard, and the sound of it rolled down the pier like a starting gun. Ronon was already moving on the second. He fought differently than Teal'c, where Teal'c was formal, economical, each movement the product of decades of systematized combat doctrine. Ronon was something raw. 7 years of running had stripped away everything ceremonial and left only function. He closed distance fast, used the corridor walls as leverage, and hit with the specific ferocity of someone who had spent the better part of a decade being angry about something and had finally found an appropriate outlet. The second Wraith soldier was considerably larger than Ronon. This did not help it. There are more coming, Teal'c said, already repositioning. His staff weapon's energy reading told him the discharge had drawn attention from further down the pier. The extraction team is larger than O'Neill projected. How much larger? A third soldier rounded the corridor bend. Then a fourth. Then 2 more behind them. Significantly, Teal'c said. In the control room, Teal'c's head came up sharply. She had been monitoring the Queen's communication patterns the way you monitored a storm. Not the words, which were too complex and too fast to fully translate in real time, but the emotional weather of them, the pressure changes that preceded action. What she felt now sent ice through her chest. She knows, Teal'c said. Daniel looked up from the console. Knows what specifically? That it's a trap. Teal'c pressed her fingers to her temple, focusing. The Queen's consciousness was enormous and cold and ancient, and touching the edge of it was like pressing your hand against the hull of a ship moving at speed. You felt the power of it without being able to direct it. She sent the extraction team as a test. To see how we responded. She already knew we would bait her. Teal'c opened her eyes. She is not delaying the fleet engagement. She never intended to. Daniel was already reaching for the radio. Jack. I heard, O'Neill's voice came back. He was in the chair room. From the quality of the transmission, slightly distorted, carrying the harmonic undertone of active ancient systems, he was already interfaced. How long until the fleet moves into range? In the control room, the sensor display answered before anyone could. The three red icons, which had been holding their patient arc, began moving. Not slowly. With the sudden, committed acceleration of something that had been waiting for permission. 19 minutes, Weir said, her voice carrying the controlled calm of someone choosing, in real time, not to show what 19 minutes felt like. Colonel Carter, Jack said through the radio. In the lower lab, Sam looked up from the distribution node she and McKay had been reconfiguring for 28 minutes. 3 more to go. Maybe 2, if, I know, she said. We're close. Define close. 2 minutes. Possibly 90 seconds. Make it 90 seconds. Working on it. McKay's hands were moving across the console with a speed that had passed beyond conscious control and entered the territory of pure trained reflex. The place where the thinking and the doing collapsed into a single operation. The tertiary harmonic is still misaligned, he said, not to Carter specifically, not to anyone, just releasing the information into the air where it could be acted on. If we bring the auxiliary conduit online before the tertiary is locked, the power surge will backfeed through the primary junction and take down the shield for approximately 4 seconds, Carter finished, already moving to the tertiary panel. Which at the current approach rate gives the lead hive ship one firing window. One firing window with a directed energy weapon capable of destroying this city. Yes, that's the problem I was describing. Locked, Carter said. McKay stared at the tertiary harmonic reading. It was locked. He checked it twice. How did you? Manual phase adjustment on the secondary coupling. It's a workaround, it won't hold indefinitely, but it'll hold long enough. She was already moving back to the primary distribution node. Bringing the auxiliary conduit online in 3, 2. The lights in the lab flickered. Every screen went briefly dark. For exactly 2 seconds, which felt considerably longer, nothing happened. Then the power readings across the city shifted. Shield efficiency climbed. ZPM output curve flattened, not reversed, not recharged, but stabilized at a sustainable drain rate that bought back the minutes they needed. In the chair room, Jack felt it. The chair he was sitting in, an extraordinary piece of engineering that felt less like furniture and more like a conversation, responded to the power increase the way a held breath responds to air. Systems came online that had been dim. The interface deepened. The city, which had been reaching toward him through the chair with the tentative quality of a weakened signal, suddenly spoke more clearly. He had interfaced with ancient technology before. The drone chair at McMurdo. The repository. Various artifacts throughout his career that had communicated with his specific genetic inheritance in ways that ranged from mildly uncomfortable to nearly lethal. This was different. This was the city itself, not a device, not a repository, but Atlantis, 10,000 years of accumulated intent pressing against his consciousness with something that felt almost, in its own alien way, like recognition. You are one of ours, it didn't say, because cities didn't speak. But something in the interface carried that quality. O'Neill. Carson Beckett's voice from across the room, carefully steady. Your vitals are elevated. The interface is deeper than I'd like. It's fine, Jack said. His voice had taken on a quality he recognized. The same quality it got during any deep interface with ancient systems, slightly removed, the foreground consciousness partially displaced by something older and larger. I can see them. See what? The ships. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet the chair hummed around him, and through the chair the city's sensor network extended outward into the ocean and the sky and the space beyond the sky, painting the approaching fleet in data that bypassed his eyes entirely and arrived directly as understanding. 3 hives. 2 cruisers behind them that weren't on the long-range scan. 5 ships total. She held 2 back. In the control room, where closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then opened them. Can you target all 5? Not yet. ZPM doesn't have the output for full salvo. He paused. I need the drones. How many does this city have? 32 functional, Zelenka's voice came over the channel. Possibly 34 if the... 32, Jack said. Okay. He ran the calculation in the part of his mind that was still purely his own, quick and unsentimental. 32 drones against 5 ships. Standard drone yield against Wraith Hive ship hull composition, based on what the expedition report said about previous engagements. It's going to be tight. Down on the East Pier, Teal'c and Ronon had fallen back to a secondary position, trading space for time, drawing the extraction team deeper into the corridor network where the confined geometry reduced the Wraith numerical advantage. The fighting was close and loud and constant. Shepard's voice crackled across the radio from the secondary approach. We've got a second boarding team on the North Pier. They're not trying to be subtle anymore. Because the Queen knows we know, Teal'c said from the control room. She has abandoned the extraction. She is trying to divide our defenses before the fleet engages. Is it working? Shepard asked. We looked at her personnel. Stretched thin across 3 defensive positions, 2 engineering teams, the control room, and a chair room running on reclaimed power and an Air Force colonel's genetic inheritance. Not yet, she said. But ask me again in 10 minutes. The first Hive ship crossed into weapons range with 16 minutes still on their estimated timeline, because the Wraith did not negotiate with estimates. In the chair room, Jack O'Neill took one long breath, pressed his hands flat against the interface surfaces, and told Atlantis it was time. The city answered. The corridor on the East Pier was 30 meters long, 2 meters wide, and had been, 40 minutes ago, a maintenance access route that nobody in Atlantis thought about particularly. It was now the most contested piece of real estate in the Pegasus Galaxy. Teal'c had been in tighter situations. He had fought inside gold pyramid ships while they were entering atmosphere. He had held a choke point on Tolana while the Talon evacuation completed around him. He had stood in corridors not unlike this one and done what needed to be done with the calm that came not from the absence of fear but from something older and more durable, the absolute certainty that retreat was not the right answer. He fired. Repositioned. Fired again. The Wraith extraction team had started as 6 soldiers. It was now 4, which was an improvement, but 4 Wraith soldiers in a 2-meter corridor was still a significant tactical problem. They didn't fall back when their numbers reduced. They didn't recalculate odds or reassess the engagement. They pressed forward with the patient, implacable certainty of things that had never needed to learn caution because caution had never been necessary. Until now. Ronon came off the wall to Teal'c's left, moving at an angle that shouldn't have worked geometrically and did anyway, firing his particle magnum in a continuous sweep that forced the lead Wraith back into the one behind it. The disruption lasted approximately 2 seconds. It was enough. Teal'c's staff weapon discharge caught the lead soldier center mass. 3. They're not stopping, Ronon said, pressing back against the wall beside him. His breathing was elevated but controlled. He had the look of a man who had been in worse places and knew it, which was a specific and useful kind of confidence. No, Teal'c agreed. They will not stop unless we stop them. He checked the corridor. The remaining 3 Wraith had pulled back to a junction point 15 meters ahead, not retreat, repositioning. They are waiting for something. Reinforcement, Ronon said. From the North Pier team. If they break through Shepard's position, they will flank us, Teal'c finished. He ran the calculation. Shepard's team was holding, but the radio traffic from the North Pier had been increasingly terse, the compression of communication that happened when people were fully occupied with staying alive and had no bandwidth left for detail. We cannot remain in this corridor. We can't leave it either. If the extraction team gets past us, they will reach the control room, Teal'c said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, the staff weapon held across his body, his breathing measured in the way he had learned to measure it over decades, not suppressing the physical reality of exertion, but organizing it, making it serve rather than consume. Then we do not remain in the corridor, and we do not leave it. Ronon looked at him. What does that mean? It means we advance. The pause that followed was brief. Then Ronon looked down the corridor at the 3 Wraith soldiers waiting at the junction with the patient confidence of predators who believed they controlled the geometry of the situation. Okay, he said. What happened next was not elegant. It was not the kind of combat that featured in military histories or tactical manuals. It was the kind that happened when 2 warriors with nothing to lose and nowhere to go decided that the only direction available was forward, and committed to that direction with everything they had. Teal'c went first, because he had the staff weapon and the staff weapon had range, and range in a confined space was the closest thing to an advantage the situation offered. He moved down the corridor at a pace that was faster than a walk and more controlled than a run, firing in a continuous sequence that forced the Wraith to respond to him rather than prepare for what was coming behind him. Ronon came 3 seconds later, low and fast, angling for the junction wall in a way that took him out of the direct line of return fire and put him, when he reached the junction, at close quarters with the rearmost Wraith soldier before it had fully redirected from tracking Teal'c. Close quarters with Ronon Dex, it turned out, was not a position that the Wraith's 10,000 years of predatory evolution had specifically prepared it for. 2. The last soldier caught Teal'c's 3rd shot as it turned to address the new threat. 1. Then none. The corridor was quiet. Both men stood in the junction, breathing hard, the smell of discharged energy weapons and something darker, the specific biological scent of Wraith, which Teal'c was already filing away as data, hanging in the recycled air. Ronon looked at the corridor behind them, then at the junction ahead, then at Teal'c. You do that a lot. Charge things that are waiting for you. When the alternative is allowing them to choose the terms of engagement, Teal'c said. Yes. Ronon was quiet for a moment. 7 years, he said. Running. Every time I stopped, they found me. Every time I fought, there were too many. He looked at his hands, the particle magnum, the Wraith issue weapon he'd taken years ago and made his own. I forgot what it felt like to choose the ground. You have not forgotten, Teal'c said. You demonstrated it 30 seconds ago. The radio crackled. Shepard's voice, tight with effort, Teal'c, Ronon, North Pier team is pushing hard. We could use a second front. Teal'c and Ronon exchanged a look. The kind that didn't require words because the words were obvious and the time required to speak them was better spent moving. They moved. The route from the East Pier junction to the North Pier secondary access ran through 3 corridors, 2 stairwells, and a maintenance hub that Ronon knew by instinct and Teal'c mapped in real time from the city's layout as he'd observed it during the initial briefing tour. It took 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the radio traffic from the control room told a story in fragments. Carter and McKay had completed the power reconfiguration, the chair was active, O'Neill had engaged the first drone salvo against the lead hive ship, and the results were inconclusive, McKay's voice said, with the specific tension of someone who had hoped for better. The hive ship sustained damage to its forward weapons array, but the hull integrity is, these things are remarkably resilient. How many drones remain? We're 26. The chair needs more power than we have for the next salvo to be definitive. Carter is working on it. Working on it is not the same as having done it, Rodney. Carter's voice, clipped and focused. I'm aware of that, thank you. Teal'c filed the information and kept moving. They came through the North Pier access at the moment the situation there had reached its most critical configuration, Shepard and Ford pinned at the far end of the corridor by a Wraith boarding team that had the numbers and the patience to simply wait them out, advancing in slow, controlled increments that traded Wraith casualties for positional advantage with a cold arithmetical logic. The Wraith boarding team had not accounted for the possibility of a threat from their rear. Teal'c and Ronon provided one. The engagement was shorter than the East Pier fight because surprise, properly applied, was a force multiplier that compensated for almost any numerical deficit. Teal'c took the rearmost two positions before the team fully registered the new threat. Ronon covered the flanks. Shepard, responding to the shift with the immediate tactical flexibility of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, pushed forward from his pinned position and closed the distance on the remaining soldiers from the opposite direction. It was over in 90 seconds. Shepard looked at Teal'c across the corridor, then at Ronon, then back at Teal'c. Nice timing. We were in the area, Teal'c said. Shepard allowed himself a brief expression that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same emotional territory. Then his radio activated and the expression disappeared. Shepard. Weir's voice. The second hive ship has moved into firing range. O'Neill is requesting everything we have left in the chair. He wants to attempt a simultaneous multi-target salvo on hives 2 and 3. Shepard looked at the ceiling, which was the direction people looked when they were processing something that required more cognitive space than horizontal vision allowed. Can the ZPM handle a simultaneous salvo? A pause. Then Carter, it will if we pull power from non-essential systems. Life support on the uninhabited sections, the long-range sensors, 3 of the external shield emitters on the leeward side. Dropping shield emitters, Ford started. Leeward, Carter said. Away from the fleet's current approach vector. It's a calculated reduction. Calculated by whom? Shepard asked. McKay and me. Simultaneously. We arrived at the same answer, which I consider fairly reliable confirmation. Shepard made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Do it. He was already moving toward the nearest transporter. Teal'c, Ronon control room. I want everyone in position when O'Neill fires. Teal'c fell into step behind him without comment. Beside him, Ronon moved with the particular quality of a man who had spent 7 years alone and was, perhaps for the first time, moving towards something rather than away from it. Above them, through the city's superstructure, the deep harmonic thrum of the drone chair reached its next crescendo, and the lights of Atlantis dimmed as everything the city had left gathered itself for what came next. The Wraith Queen had no name that translated into any human language. She had existed for 3,000 years, which was neither old nor young by the standards of her kind, and in those 3,000 years she had led 17 cullings, destroyed 4 civilizations that had dared to resist her, and personally fed upon 11,000 human lives. She did not think of these things as accomplishments. She thought of them the way humans thought of breathing. As the natural order of existence, unremarkable, continuous, and entirely without alternative. She had never been surprised. Until now. She sat at the command nexus of her hive ship, not a throne, exactly, though it functioned as one, the organic architecture of the ship's nervous system interfacing directly with her consciousness so that the hive was, in the most literal sense, an extension of her body. She felt the drone strike on the forward hive through that connection as a physical sensation, not pain. The Wraith did not process damage the way lesser species did, but wrongness, a disruption in a system that should have been invulnerable. She reached outward with her mind, touching the consciousness of her fleet commanders, her soldiers, her drones. The boarding teams on Atlantis were reduced. The extraction had failed. The city's weapons platform was active in a way her intelligence had not predicted, not simply operational, but fluid, responding to its operator with an intimacy that suggested a gene expression of extraordinary strength. She had known about the gene. The Lantean bloodline that persisted in certain human populations, the inheritance that allowed lesser beings to operate ancient technology. She had catalogued it, studied it, considered it strategically. What she had not anticipated was finding it here, now, in a being who also carried knowledge of technologies and enemies entirely outside her experience. She reached deeper into the boarding team's residual consciousness. The soldiers were gone, but the psychic echo of their final moments remained in the hive mind like the afterimage of a bright light, and found what they had seen before the end. Not just 4 humans. 4 humans who moved and fought and thought like a unit, like something that had been tested in fires she had no frame of reference for, and had come through those fires changed rather than destroyed. The large one who fought with a weapon of focused plasma energy. The way he moved, not like a soldier following doctrine, but like a force of nature that had learned to aim itself. The woman in the engineering section whose mind, even glimpsed at the edge of psychic awareness, had the quality of a precisely calibrated instrument. The thoughts moving through it too fast, too structured, too certain to be anything but extraordinary. The scholar. The one the other Athosian woman feared for specifically. She had caught that fear at the edge of Teal'c Emigan's consciousness during the initial boarding approach, not fear of the scholar's power, but fear for him, which was a different and more interesting thing. What did he know that made others afraid of losing him? And behind all of them, in the chair, the one she could feel most clearly because the chair itself was ancient and the ancient systems resonated with her hive's own organic technology at a frequency that was almost a conversation, that one was the most dangerous. Not because of the drones he was firing, though those were concerning. Because of the quality of his interface with the city. Because Atlantis was responding to him in a way she had not observed it respond to the shepherd human, who was also a strong gene carrier. The city recognized this new one differently. More completely. As though something in his specific inheritance spoke to something in Atlantis's fundamental architecture, she made a decision. She opened a channel to Atlantis. In the control room, every screen flickered simultaneously. The communication systems, which had been configured for internal use only during the siege, activated without invitation, and a voice came through that was not transmitted through any technology anyone in the room could identify. It arrived the way the Wraith always arrived. Without permission, filling the space it entered with the cold certainty of something that had never needed to ask. Atlantis. The voice was female and ancient and carried the specific resonance of something that had learned human vocal patterns as a second language and used them with perfect precision and zero warmth. You have brought something new into this galaxy. I would speak with it. We looked at Teal'c. Teal'c's face had gone carefully still. The stillness of someone maintaining control over a connection they hadn't chosen. She's speaking through the hive's psychic network, Teal'c said quietly. She's strong enough to project it into the city's communication systems directly. A pause. She's not speaking to you, Dr. Weir. She's speaking to Colonel O'Neill. In the chair room, Jack heard it. The voice arrived not through the room's speakers but through the chair's interface directly. Bypassing his ears and arriving in his consciousness the way the city's own data did, which was deeply uncomfortable in a way he was choosing not to dwell on. He answered the way he answered most things that surprised him, with complete external calm and a rapid internal assessment of how to use it. I'm a little busy right now, he said aloud, knowing the chair's interface would carry it. Your drones are insufficient. The Queen's voice carried no anger, no urgency. It carried the tone of someone sharing an objective assessment. You have 23 remaining. My forward hive ship has sustained damage but remains combat effective. My second and third ships are undamaged. Your power reserves cannot sustain the output required to destroy all 3 before my fleet reaches optimal firing range. You know this. Jack did know this. That was the part he was working on. I am not offering surrender, the voice continued. I am offering an exchange. The knowledge you carry, of your galaxy, your enemies, your technologies. Give it to me willingly and I will withdraw my fleet. Atlantis survives. Your people survive. You return to your own galaxy with your lives. The control room was very quiet. Daniel had gone still in the way he went still when something important was happening that required every cognitive resource he had. He was listening to the Queen's offer not as a threat to be feared but as a communication to be analyzed, the word choices, the structure of the proposal, what it revealed about her priorities and her uncertainties. She was afraid of something. Not of them, not exactly. Of what they represented. Of the unknown quantity of a galaxy she had no intelligence on, full of enemies she couldn't model, technologies she couldn't predict. She wanted the information because the information was the threat. Remove the unknown, remove the fear. He reached for his radio. Jack. Heard you, Jack said. His voice through the chair room feed was the slightly displaced version, the one that meant the interface was running deep. She's bluffing. I do not bluff, the Queen said. I have not needed to. First time for everything, Jack said. He was quiet for a moment, and through the chair's interface he could feel the city around him, the shield holding at reduced capacity on the leeward side, the drone bays cycling through their remaining inventory, the power distribution network that Carter and McKay had reconfigured humming at its new equilibrium. He could feel, at the edge of the city's sensor reach, the 5 Wraith ships and their exact positions and the geometry of their approach vectors and the specific firing solutions available from the chair's current interface depth. He could see something the Queen didn't know he could see. The 2 hidden cruisers she'd held back from the initial scan, not behind the hive ships, as their last recorded position suggested, but moving laterally, wide arc, coming around the planet's curvature to approach from the eastern quadrant. A flanking move. Prepared well in advance. The Queen's withdrawal offer wasn't a bluff exactly, it was a delay tactic. Keep them talking while the cruisers completed their flanking arc and hit the leeward side of the shield where 3 emitters were currently offline. Calculated, he thought. She's good. Daniel, he said. Already there, Daniel said through the radio. The offer is designed to buy approximately 11 minutes. The cruiser flanking arc completes in 11 minutes, Jack confirmed. Yeah. Another silence. Then we're, Colonel O'Neill. What do you need? Jack ran the numbers one more time. 23 drones. 5 ships. Current power output. The geometric relationship between the hive ship's positions and the chair's firing solutions. The 11-minute window before the flanking arc completed. The specific vulnerability window in a Wraith hive ship's hull that the expedition reports had identified, the engine housing, where the organic and technological systems interfaced and the hull plating was thinner to allow for heat dispersion. It was tight. It was very tight. It required a firing solution of a complexity that the chair's automated targeting system wasn't designed for, not a salvo, exactly, but a sequential precision engagement that used each drone's flight path to mask the next drone's approach vector from the hive ship's point defense systems. He'd never done it before. He wasn't entirely sure it was possible. He was going to find out. Carter, he said. Yes. I need everything. Every what the city has that isn't keeping the shield up and people breathing. Pull it all and route it to the chair. A pause. Jack, that level of interface intensity, the chair wasn't designed for sustained operation at full power draw. The neural feedback could. Carter. Another pause. Shorter. Understood. Give me 90 seconds. The Queen's voice returned, patient and cold. Your silence is your answer, Colonel. I had hoped you were wiser than the Lanteans who built this city. They too chose defiance. You know how that ended. I know how a lot of things ended, Jack said. I'm still here. He closed his eyes. He pressed his hands flat against the chair's interface surfaces. He let Atlantis in. The city came rushing through the connection like a tide, not overwhelming, not hostile, but enormous and ancient and absolutely certain of what it was, and what it needed, and what the person in its chair was there to do. 10,000 years of waiting collapsed into a single operational moment. The drone bays mapped themselves across his consciousness. The firing solutions arranged themselves with a clarity that bypassed calculation entirely and arrived as pure spatial understanding. He could see all 5 ships. He could see exactly where to hit them. "We're," he said, and his voice through the chair room speakers had taken on a quality that made Carson Beckett take an involuntary step backward. "Not inhuman. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting in the city's architecture for a very long time for exactly the right person to sit down and listen. Tell your people to hold on." The first drone left its bay at 0412 local Atlantis time, moving through the pre-dawn dark above the ocean at a velocity that made it visible only as a streak of blue-white light, gone before the eye could fully register it. The second followed 3 seconds later, angled differently, not at the same target, but at a point in space that the first drone's flight path had just vacated, using the displacement wake to confuse the hive ship's point defense tracking. The third came 4 seconds after that, lower, skimming the ocean surface close enough to raise a line of spray before pulling up sharply on its terminal approach. It was not how drones were supposed to be fired. The chair's automated targeting system operated on a salvo principle, mass deployment, overlapping coverage, volume of fire compensating for individual guidance limitations. What Jack O'Neill was doing through the interface was something the system hadn't been designed for and couldn't have executed autonomously. He was flying each drone individually. Not sequentially in the sense of firing one and waiting. Sequentially in the sense of maintaining simultaneous awareness of 23 separate flight paths, adjusting each in real time, threading them through the point defense coverage gaps of 5 ships whose defensive systems were themselves adapting to each new approach vector. It was, by any reasonable measure, impossible. Carson Beckett was monitoring Jack's neural feedback readings from across the room and had stopped sharing the numbers with anyone because the numbers had passed the threshold that the medical literature on ancient chair interface suggested as the absolute upper limit of safe operation, and sharing them would have created a panic that nobody had the bandwidth to manage right now. He kept watching. He kept his crash cart ready. He did not look away. In the control room, nobody spoke. The tactical display showed the drone tracks as thin blue lines extending from Atlantis's position toward the 5 Wraith ships, not straight lines, but curved, intersecting, a geometry that looked almost organic, like something grown rather than calculated. We watched it with her hands flat on the console edge and her breathing very controlled. Beside her, Teal'c had her eyes closed. She could feel the Queen. The Queen's consciousness had shifted. The cold certainty that had characterized it through the siege, through 3,000 years of unchallenged predation, had developed a new quality in the last 90 seconds. Not fear exactly. The Wraith Queen was too old and too powerful for what humans meant by fear. But something adjacent, the specific alertness of a being encountering something outside its models, something its 10,000 years of experience had not equipped it to predict. She was trying to understand what was happening to her fleet. The first drone hit the forward hive ship's engine housing at the precise angle that the expedition reports had identified as the hull's minimum thickness point. The explosion was not large by the standards of ship-to-ship engagement. It didn't need to be. It needed to be exact. The secondary detonation that followed, the chain reaction through the organic technological interface systems that the Wraith used for propulsion, was considerably larger. The forward hive ship lost primary power. Not destroyed. Not yet. But stopped, in the way that a thing with no power and no propulsion and cascading internal failures was stopped, not moving, not firing, not a threat for the next critical minutes. The second drone salvo hit the first cruiser.
In the chair room, Jack's hands were completely still against the interface surfaces. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and regular, which Carson found both reassuring and deeply concerning, reassuring because it suggested controlled operation, concerning because the neural feedback reading said his brain was doing things that human brains were not architecturally designed to do, and controlled operation under those conditions was not sustainable. "O'Neill," Carson said quietly. Not asking him to stop. Just reminding him that someone was there. No response. Not because Jack couldn't hear him. Because the part of Jack that would normally process and respond to a voice in the room was currently occupied with something else entirely. The second cruiser came about, changing its flanking arc as its commander recognized that the approach vector had been anticipated. It was a good adjustment, tactically sound, made quickly, exactly what a competent officer would do. It would have worked against the chair's automated targeting system, which couldn't update firing solutions fast enough to account for real-time course changes. It did not work against Jack O'Neill, who was not using the automated targeting system. 3 drones redirected simultaneously. The cruiser's new course put it directly into the path of all 3. The second cruiser went dark. 2 down, Shepard said from the control room doorway, his voice carrying the particular restraint of someone who wanted very much to react more strongly but was choosing not to jinx it. 3 hive ships still active. The second and third are adjusting formation, they're pulling the damaged forward ship between them. Using it as cover. "He can see that," Daniel said quietly, watching the tactical display. "He can see everything the city's sensors can see. Can he fire through it?" Shepard asked. Daniel thought about the conversation in the database room. About what Jack O'Neill was, underneath the dry humor and the deliberate understatement and the carefully maintained impression of someone who paid minimal attention. He thought about 8 years of impossible situations and the consistent, unreasonable fact of survival. "Yes," he said. "I think he can." In the Queen's hive ship, something was happening that had not happened to the Queen in 3,000 years. She was losing. She pressed outward with her full psychic strength, reaching for the consciousness in the chair, trying to understand it, trying to find the edges of it where she could apply pressure. What she found was not what she expected. There was a human mind there, genuinely human, not ancient, not ascended, not enhanced by any technology she recognized. A human mind that was, in its unaugmented state, probably unremarkable by the standards of its species. But the city had taken that human mind and given it a context it was, against all probability, suited for. Not the technical context, the chair's systems were handling the technical execution. The human mind was providing something the automated systems couldn't. Judgment. The ability to look at 23 drones and 5 ships and a geometry of destruction and make the 1,000 small decisions per second that separated a plan from an execution. The Queen had underestimated the gene. She had thought of it as an ignition key, a biological credential that unlocked ancient systems. She had not considered that the right key in the right lock might constitute something more fundamental. An actual conversation between a civilization's legacy and the bloodline it had left behind. She reached for the consciousness in the chair one final time. Not to extract information. To understand what she was facing. What reached back was not hostile. It was not triumphant. It was tired, in the way that people who had been doing impossible things for a very long time were tired. Not defeated, not broken, but worn at the edges in a way that was entirely honest about what sustained this kind of existence cost. And behind the tiredness, absolutely immovable, something that the Queen had no word for in her own language and found, in the human vocabulary, she had learned over millennia, only one approximate translation. Resolve. She broke the connection. Teal'c. Her voice through the communication system had changed. The cold certainty was still there, but something in the architecture of the communication was different. Teal'c opened her eyes. The being in the chair. What is it? Teal'c considered the question. A person, she said. Who has been asked to do extraordinary things and has not refused. A long silence. The flanking arc is aborted, Shepard said, looking at the tactical display. The two undamaged hives they're pulling back. Changing formation entirely. He looked up. They're repositioning away from the city. She's withdrawing the fleet, Weir said. Partial withdrawal, Zelenka corrected, watching his screen. The damaged forward hive is still in place. No propulsion. She can't move it. She's leaving it, Teal'c said quietly. She could feel the Queen's consciousness receding. Not fleeing, not panicked, but executing a deliberate strategic withdrawal with the measured efficiency of someone who had revised their assessment and was acting accordingly. She is leaving the damaged ship and withdrawing the rest of the fleet. She's cutting her losses, Daniel said. She is reassessing, Teal'c said. There is a difference. She paused, feeling the last edges of the Queen's consciousness as it moved away. She will not forget this. She will study it. She will return with a different approach. She looked at Weir. But not today. In the chair room, the drones stopped firing. The tactical geometry had resolved. The forward hive ship was dead in space, its crew beginning emergency evacuation procedures that would take longer than the ship had left in its structural integrity. The two cruisers were gone. The remaining two hives were moving at speed away from Atlantis's position, their retreat carrying the particular quality of a thing that had chosen to survive over a thing that had chosen to win. Carson crossed to the chair in 4 quick steps. Jack's eyes were open. They had been open, Carson realized, for some time, open and focused on the ceiling with the specific quality of someone who was present in the room but present from a considerable distance. Colonel O'Neill, Carson said. Can you hear me? A pause. Then, yeah. The voice was rough. The displaced quality was gone. He was entirely back in the room, which was both a relief and its own kind of concern, because the return from that depth of interface was not, in Carson's limited experience with it, a comfortable transition. Did it work? Carson looked at the tactical display on the wall screen. 2 hives in retreat. 2 cruisers destroyed. 1 hive ship dead in space and losing structural integrity. The city's shield holding. The lights on. The people alive. It worked, he said. Jack closed his eyes. Good, he said. That's good. A pause. I'm going to need a minute. Take as many as you like, Carson said, and meant it completely. Through the chair room's high windows, the sky above Atlantis was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. The specific pale quality of a dawn that had been genuinely uncertain and had arrived anyway, the way dawns did, indifferent to whether anyone below deserved it or had earned it or had simply, against considerable odds, managed to still be there when it came. The siege of Atlantis was over. What came after it was something none of them had words for yet. The hours after the siege had a quality that veterans recognized and civilians rarely understood. Not celebration, not relief exactly, but the strange suspended stillness of people whose entire nervous system had been calibrated for a crisis that had suddenly, incompletely, resolved. The body didn't know what to do with the absence of immediate threat. It kept looking for the next thing, the next decision, the next incoming contact on the sensors, and finding instead the ordinary business of survival. Damage assessment, medical rounds, power system checks, the 1,000 administrative consequences of a battle that was over but not finished. Atlantis breathed. Not metaphorically. The city's ventilation systems, which had been running at reduced capacity during the siege to preserve power, came back to full operation as Carter and McKay walked the distribution network through its post-engagement recalibration. The sound of it moved through the corridors like something released. A slow, deep exhalation from 10,000 years of architecture that had, for one more day, kept its people alive.
We found O'Neill on one of the lower balconies, watching the ocean catch the morning light. He had a cup of coffee that someone, probably Shepard, who had an instinct for these things, had brought him, and he was holding it in both hands in the way people held warm things when they needed something to hold. Carson had cleared him physically with the specific reluctance of a doctor who knew the readings didn't tell the whole story. The neural feedback from the chair interface had been extraordinary. What it had done to the architecture of Jack O'Neill's relationship with his own mind was something that would take weeks to fully understand. He looked, from a distance, like a man having a quiet morning. Up close, he looked like a man who had been somewhere very far away and had made it back, and was still in the process of locating all the pieces of himself that the journey had displaced. "Dr. Weir," he said, without turning. "Colonel." She stood beside him, looking at the same ocean. The wreckage of the forward hive ship was visible on the horizon, a dark mass settling slowly into the water, its organic structure losing cohesion as the systems that maintained it failed one by one. "How are you?" "Fine," he said, in the way that meant he was processing something he hadn't finished processing yet and wasn't going to discuss until he had. She accepted that. She had learned, in the last 12 hours, to read Jack O'Neill's silences the way she'd learned to read Shepard's shrugs, not as absence of communication, but as a different kind of it. "The expedition owes your team a debt," she said. "I want to be direct about that. Without the power reconfiguration, without the tactical plan, without what you did in that chair. You would have found another way," Jack said. "We might have," Weir said honestly. "Or we might not have. We were very close to the end of our options." She paused. "Either way, you were here, and it mattered, and I don't want that to go unsaid." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your people are extraordinary. I want that to go unsaid even less." He looked at the ocean. "A year out here, with no backup, no reinforcement, fighting an enemy that makes the gold look straightforward, and they're still standing. Still functioning as a unit. Still," he paused, selecting the word carefully. "Still whole. That doesn't happen by accident." "No," Weir agreed. "It doesn't." They stood together in the morning light, and the ocean moved the way oceans moved, indifferent to the events that had occurred above it, patient in the way that things were patient when measured in geological time rather than human urgency. "The gate connection," Jack said. "Any idea if it can be re-established?" "Zelenka and Carter have been working on it since 0600. The energy signature that created the bridge has dissipated, but Carter believes the mathematical structure of it is recoverable, that the same dialing sequence, under the same conditions, could recreate it." Weir paused. "She estimates it could be made reliable within 2 to 3 weeks of work. A permanent bridge between the gate networks," Jack said. "A potential one. With significant power requirements and considerable technical risk." Weir looked at him. "But possible." The implications settled between them without needing to be spoken fully. A reliable connection between the Milky Way and Pegasus networks. SGC reinforcements for Atlantis. Wraith intelligence flowing back to Earth. 2 expeditions, built on different galaxies' experiences, able to share what they'd learned. The Daedalus' 18-day journey rendered, if not obsolete, then supplementable. Everything Atlantis had been doing without, for a year, potentially addressable. "I'll talk to Carter," Jack said. Elsewhere in the city, the other conversations were happening. The ones that would also echo forward. Daniel and Teal'c sat in the database room again, but differently than they had before the siege. The urgency was gone, replaced by something more deliberate, 2 people who had discovered, in the compressed time of an emergency, that they thought about the universe in compatible ways, and were now exploring what that meant with the luxury of being able to finish sentences. "The Wraith origin records," Daniel said, pulling up the sequence he'd found the previous night. "The biological conversion event. I'd like to spend real time on this. Not just for tactical understanding, for ethical understanding." Teal'c looked at him.
Ethical. If the Wraith were changed, if what they are now isn't what they were originally, that has implications for how the conflict is approached. Not whether to fight. They have to be fought. But how? Whether there are possibilities that haven't been explored because the framing has always been predator and prey rather than, he paused, searching. Rather than a tragedy that went wrong somewhere and might, someday, in some form, have a different resolution. Teal'c was quiet for a long moment. My people have never been permitted that thought, she said finally. The Wraith have fed on us for 10,000 years. Survival required a specific kind of thinking. I know, Daniel said. I'm not suggesting your thinking was wrong. I'm suggesting that having someone from outside that history might allow some questions that couldn't be asked from inside it. He looked at her. If that's useful. It might be, Teal'c said. It might be the most useful thing anyone from your galaxy has brought to ours. In the engineering lab, Carter and McKay had moved past the post-crisis efficiency of the power reconfiguration and into something more complicated. Two brilliant minds no longer operating on adrenaline and necessity, now operating on genuine intellectual curiosity, which was both more productive and more contentious. The bridge equation needs a phase correction, McKay said. The phase correction I already applied, Carter said. Your phase correction. I'm suggesting a different one. Yours introduces a variance at the 7th harmonic. Which the 8th harmonic compensates for. If the 8th harmonic behaves as predicted, which in a cross-network connection it may not. Which is why we test it. They had been doing this for 3 hours. Zelenka, working at the adjacent console, had long since learned to extract the productive content from these exchanges and ignore the interpersonal friction, which was itself a form of respect. Two people only argued this specifically about things they both cared about deeply enough to be wrong in front of each other. The bridge equation was getting better with every exchange. Teal'c and Ronon were in the East Pier corridor. Not fighting, standing at the junction where they'd made their advance the night before, in the quiet way that warriors return to significant ground. Not nostalgia. Assessment. The understanding of a space that had been contested and was now, for now, held. You will return to your galaxy, Ronon said. It was not a question. When the gate connection is established, Teal'c confirmed. Yes. And the Wraith will still be here. Yes, Teal'c said. But so will Atlantis. He looked at Ronon. And you are no longer running. Ronon looked at the corridor for a long moment. At the scorch marks from the staff weapon. At the ceiling where the lighting had been damaged in the fight and not yet repaired, the exposed conduit catching the morning light from a window at the corridor's end. At his own hands. No, he said. I'm not. The morning moved through Atlantis the way mornings moved through places that had survived the night, with a specific quality of continuance, ordinary and extraordinary at once, the unremarkable miracle of time proceeding forward. Shepard found O'Neill still on the balcony at mid-morning, the coffee long finished, the ocean doing what it always did. Hell of a first day, Shepard said. I've had worse, Jack said. Really? Couple of times. He looked at the younger man. You built something good out here, Major. Your people are, they're the real thing. Shepard looked at the ocean. Something moved through his expression that he didn't try to manage or conceal, the complicated thing that happened when someone from outside confirmed what you had believed about your people and hadn't been entirely sure you were right to believe. Yeah, he said quietly. They are. They stood in a comfortable silence that had the quality of a conversation that didn't need words because the words had already been established by everything that preceded it. Below them, the city moved and breathed and continued its ancient patient work of being a home at the edge of the possible. The Stargate in the gate room below stood dormant, waiting for the connection that Carter and McKay were building toward, the bridge that would mean Atlantis was never again entirely alone. In the chair room, the chair was empty and still, its interface surfaces quiescent. Holding in whatever passed for its memory the experience of the morning, the particular human mind it had spoken with, the conversation between a civilization's legacy and its own blood, the moment when everything the ancients had built and left behind had found, for a few extraordinary hours, exactly the person it needed. The city kept that. The way cities kept things. Not in records, not in databases, but in the quality of the light in certain rooms, in the resonance of corridors that had seen significant things, in the deep structural memory of architecture that had been, however briefly, fully alive. Atlantis remembered. And in the space between galaxies, in the mathematical ghost of a gate connection that two brilliant women were slowly, argumentatively, certainly reconstructing, the distance between two expeditions that had been fighting the same fight in different corners of the universe was becoming, for the first time, crossable. The Wraith siege of Atlantis had been, by any measure, a catastrophe that didn't happen. The city stood. Its people lived. The fleet that had come to end 10,000 years of ancient legacy had instead encountered something the Wraith Queen had not modeled in 3,000 years of strategic thinking, the specific consequence of two groups of humans, forged in different galaxies by different impossible fires, finding each other at exactly the moment when one of them had nothing left. What SG-1 brought to Atlantis was not simply firepower or technical expertise, though both mattered. They brought the proof that survival was possible. That enemies who seemed like forces of nature could be understood, outmaneuvered, and defeated. That a year of isolation had not made Atlantis weak, it had made it ready for exactly this kind of convergence. The gate bridge that Carter and McKay built in the weeks following would change everything about the Pegasus expedition, reinforcements, resources, the accumulated knowledge of 8 years fighting the impossible. But the more important thing had already happened on the morning after the siege, in the corridors and labs and balconies of a city that had held on long enough for help to find it. 2 teams. 2 galaxies. One understanding, arrived at in the crucible of a night that could have ended everything. The Wraith Queen withdrew and studied and would return. The fight was not finished. It never was. But Atlantis was no longer alone in it. May the Force be with you. More stories await.